The discontent of EU citizens with the Union has been growing fast over the past decade and has doubled since 2012. Democracy has started translating this dissatisfaction into new political realities via the ballot box. Often, it seems that dissatisfaction with the Union is coming from underdeveloped regions of the EU, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. At the same time, we've also seen a rise of parties opposed to the EU integration across the continent. So what is the geography of EU discontent? What can regional analyses of the citizens' dissatisfaction reveal about the places that are most anti-EU? And is Brussels doing enough? So what is the geography of EU discontent? It is simply the reaction by citizens against the Union. These feelings can range from mild Euroscepticism, renouncing further EU integration, all the way to a rejection of European Union altogether. From 2004 to 2012, the share of citizens over 15 who did not trust the EU increased from 28 to 47%, and though it dropped to 39 in 2018, it remains well above levels from 2 decades ago. In some member states, the situation is even more dramatic. In Greece, for example, the level of distrust increased by 48%, and by now, 2/3 of the Greek population tends not to trust the EU, the highest in the bloc. Sometimes, the distrust can translate into votes for Eurosceptic parties, but not always. Denmark has one of the lowest levels of distrust, and yet a high share of votes for parties opposed to EU integration. Up until recently, the opposite was true in Spain. With some of the highest distrust towards the EU, there were no big parties opposed to integration, though this has changed with the rise of Vox. Places that vote for anti-EU parties are diverse and span the entirety of the Union. Some of the hotspots are in southern Denmark, northern Italy, southern Austria, eastern Germany, eastern Hungary, or southern Portugal. The picture is even more worrying when slightly less radical but still Eurosceptic votes are taken into account. Then, half of Europe turns to parties that are at least somewhat anti-EU. So what determines discontent with the EU? The reasons seem to be complex, and many have tried to explain anti-establishment votes by analyzing employment opportunities, demographic changes like aging, or how rural or remote a region is. A group of researchers, however, seems to think that what we must look at is not only at how poor a region is, but also at places left behind, which have experienced a long-term stagnation or slump. They say anti-EU voting can be mainly explained by long-term economic and industrial decline, low levels of education, and a lack of local employment opportunities. Once these are taken into account, richer places actually tend to vote more for anti-EU parties than poor places. We have spoken to one of the authors of the study, Professor Andrés Rodríguez-Posé.
What we have is that there's a brewing discontent in many areas of Europe, like, for example, the north of Italy, that in some cases remain rich, but have witnessed 3 decades of no growth whatsoever. So the inhabitants in places like Cremona, in places like Bergamo, in places like Brescia, in places like Pavia, that are still relatively wealthy in a European context, they know that their future is not particularly bright because they have had no growth for 30 years, and they know that their children are going to have far less opportunities than they had, and they are having less opportunities than their parents had. And this is something that means that this is brewing discontent. We have channeled for funds and resources and investment to the least developed places, and rightly so. But those areas that have been relatively well off but have been declining for a long time, that have been increasingly in a development trap, have been falling through the cracks in the system, and therefore are saying enough is enough. There's potential virtually in every region in Europe, and that many areas that are declining can see the emergence of let's say, dynamic competitive firms, that these firms not always emerge in the big cities.
It's true. Examples of European firms coming from remote places abound. IKEA, the biggest furniture store in the world, came not from Stockholm, but from Anhalt, a city that had just 9,000 inhabitants in 2010. The same is true of Zara, which came from Arteixo, an industrial town with 31,000 inhabitants in the suburbs of A Coruña, Spain. So what can the EU do? Just as the issue of rising anti-EU attitudes itself, the solution will have to be probably multifaceted. One of the pieces of a larger puzzle can be spending money in the right regions. Research has found that one of the side effects of investment into regional development seems to be a reduction in the votes for parties openly hostile to European integration. At the same time, as we have seen, it will be crucial to not leave behind areas that once might have been okay, but have received little attention in the past decades. As countries battle with the coronavirus, the pandemic is both a challenge for Europe, but also an opportunity to show the value of cooperation. If the €750 billion recovery fund, coupled with the EU's long-term structural support, are invested smartly, we could see a quick rebound, potentially followed by a rise in support for the Union. However, and as we've seen in the past, if the recovery is mismanaged, the EU makes an easy scapegoat.